Hi, everybody, as you're coming in. Welcome. Welcome. We're going to put up this slide so you know you're in the right place. And as you come in, we want to welcome you to our conversation. And I'm going to transition now out of that. And again, welcome you. My name is Chelsea Bailey, and this is the RISI Global Conversations conversation event. We try to do these as often as we can. And the title of our event today is Four Voices, One Conversation, Scholar Educators Dialoguing in Times of Crisis. And we are really excited to have you here today. I want to go over here. And we are going to hand things over now to Kim, who is going to do a land acknowledgement for us.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to offer an acknowledgement of country here from the state of Victoria in Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Wadawurrung country here as part of the Kulin Nations. This land is unceded and the sovereign land of the Wadawurrung people. And I'd like to acknowledge all the vast lands that we're meeting from today, the communities that we are part of, and our elders and ancestors that continually guide us in our knowledges, ways of being, knowing, and doing, and have so for thousands of years. And I'd like to acknowledge too any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous people from across our globe here today, and their continual ways of knowing, doing, and being, and the conversations that we always continue.
Thank you so much, Kim. And as we transition into our conversation, before we do that, I want to mention that there is a RISI conference coming up, and it is going to be at the Erickson Institute in Chicago, and the theme title is Justice for Young Children, Families, and Communities, an Ethical Imperative, and that's going to be November 1st through 5th. Again, at the Erickson Institute, and you can go to the RISI website for more information, and we'll share more information a little later. Now we're going to transition to our panel itself, and we're going to begin. I want to begin by introducing you to Janelle Brady, who is going to be our facilitator for the conversation today. I want to tell you a little bit about all the wonderful things that Janelle brings with her today. She's an assistant professor of Black Studies in the School of Early Childhood Studies at the faculty of the Community Services at the Toronto Metropolitan University. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto in the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Her areas of expertise or her areas of research explores Black mothers' effective resistance strategies, race and racism in early years, and Black feminism. She's passionate about supporting children and families through engagement in various community-based research projects to enhance social justice and racial justice. Janelle's work has been presented at peer-reviewed research conferences such as the American Educational Research Association, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and the Canadian Sociological Association. Some of her peer-reviewed publications appear in the Canadian Journal for New Scholars in Education, the Wiley-Blackwell Encyclopedia of Social Theory, Emerging Perspectives, Palgrave Macmillan, and Myers Education Press. Her two most recent articles were published in Contemporary Issues in Early Childhood and the Journal of Motherhood Initiative. I'm going to hand it over to Janelle now, and we're going to begin.
Thanks so much, Chelsea, for that introduction. I'm really thrilled to be with all of you today. Just picking up on Kim's land acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Toronto, otherwise known as Toronto. It's covered with the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, and it's a territory that has bound everyone to share and protect the land under this Dish with One Spoon agreement. I think it's important for myself, especially in a conversation such as the conversation we're having today, to situate where I'm joining you all from, and especially as a Black woman scholar, to think about and to work towards active decolonization as an ongoing project and quest for justice. Um, and in terms of this discussion that I've been so excited about having, and it's finally here today, I want to share a couple of points in terms of how we talk to each other. So you would have received the description when mentioning we were talking about scholar educators. We're talking about speaking with children, pre-service and early career teachers, and peers. We're talking about really how we talk with one another in this time of confusion, crisis, and grief. And the solution is not to shut down and not have any discussions, but hopefully this dialogue between the three wonderful scholars that we have today will help to model what some of these conversations might look like and help us to imagine new ways of discussing and bringing in old ways which might have been forgotten as a project of reclamation. So I'd like to introduce the speakers. I'm very thrilled to introduce three brilliant speakers to you today. First is Kim Kinnear. Kim Kinnear's academic work intersects across wide but interconnected spaces. Kim is an Indigenous Knowledges lecturer at the NIKERI Institute at Deakin University on Wadawurrung country in Australia. She is a descendant of the Ad Adnyamathanha and Nukunu communities in South Australia, who proudly speaks to past and current colonizing harms experienced by First Nations communities in Australia. Kim is also an early childhood teacher with experience in a range of services bringing Indigenous knowledges to the foreground alongside children, families, and colleagues as part of challenging, reflective, and socially just practices. Kim experiences legal blindness alongside her assistant's dog, Rhea, who and has worked as an early childhood teacher, writing about her lived experiences of how it is to live with a dis/ability and teach on country as part of her current PhD studies. Welcome, Kim. Next, we have Nidhi Menon. Dr. Nidhi Menon is a scholar of social justice education and a recent graduate from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. At the University of Toronto, her research interests center equity, diversity, and inclusion through her work with newcomer families and young children using culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy. Her research interests include disrupting colonial ways of being and doing and troubling deficit frames rooted in neoliberal and Western ideologies. She works on identifying and amplifying strengths-based approaches and practices that center cultural identities. She is committed to exploring the complicated relationships between power and privilege through a lens of intersectionality to understand how community programs, educators, and educational institutions can work towards transformational change at micro and macro levels. Dr. Angela Molloy-Murphy is an early childhood lecturer and post-qualitative researcher at the University of Melbourne. Her research activates critical post-humanism and experimental arts practices to explore children's multimodal storying with place and the more than human. She argues that we are in need of stories that acknowledge the complex, more than human nature of justice and imagine creative possibilities for thinking, relating otherwise. Angela currently acts as a scholar in residence at Catherine Coleman and Sarah Healy's Speculative Wanderings and Space and Place Lab, otherwise known as the SWISP Lab, at the University of Melbourne. So welcome, Angela and Nidhi. And just in terms of the flow of the event for today, first we're going to open up with some questions and have we're going to hear from Kim, Nidhi, and Angela in dialogue with one another. We have 3 main questions and they'll be in conversation with each other. After we get to roughly the 1 hour-ish mark, we will be opening up to Zoom meeting. So we're going to switch from webinar, which we're in right now, and we're going to be teleported to a meeting structure. So when that happens, rest assured, I'll provide some prompts in terms of what's going to take place. And really what that allows for is some engagement from the audience to ask questions from all of you, because we really want to learn from each of you so we can be in dialogue together. And I'll acknowledge raised hands, and you can also share your questions in the chat, but I'll ask that we wait until we get to that moment so that we can be in conversation with each other for the final half hour of today's event. So with that, I will transition to the questions. So the first question for the 3 scholars is, what does conversation look like? So how and where do we talk to each other? So I'll turn it over to Angela to start us off in terms of this question around what does conversation look like?
Thank you, Janelle. And thank you everyone for joining us. So when I think about conversation, my mind goes to my area of work and thinking, which is multimodality. And I think about the conversations that aren't had explicitly through dialogue like we're having today, sometimes come out in art forms like song or dance or storying or graffiti. Sometimes the stories that have been silenced come out in those artistic or visual ways and come more in your face because they haven't been welcomed in other ways. And certainly in this era, sometimes conversation is happening online, not only in forums like this, but through art stories like Instagram stories and other sort of TikTok things that people just experience that end up being at risk of being one-sided. And there's ways that they kind of come in to try to become a dialogue, but it's difficult. And I think with young people, sometimes these ways are more of like a proxy for the kind of conversation we're having today, or the kind of conversations we would hope to see that are nuanced and complex and difficult. It becomes like a giving of information and then a returning of information and an exchange that is important. It's a lot of those are activist spaces. But again, it doesn't allow for the nuance that we would hope for. Okay, I think once some of you are talking, then I'll have more to respond to.
Thanks, Nidhi. I wonder, thanks, Angela. My apologies, because I was looking at Nidhi. I wonder if Kim, you'd like to pick up on anything Angela said in terms of those nuanced pieces.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think from what Angela's saying there as well. I'm picking up on that complexity as well. And the histories of conversation, I think, are important as part of that complexity as well. So as an Numatna and Nukanu woman, an Aboriginal woman of Australia, our conversations are very cultural and tell the stories of our ancestors, but will also tell the stories of our future. And you know, they're a very important part of our histories as well as our futures. And so everything's always moving in between the past and what is to become as well. And as part of those cultural stories, I think what's important in those conversations is that these are always conversations that are held in respect, that are held responsively with one another, and assumes that the person that's part of that conversation, which would be a person in community, is upheld as capable, competent, and always and already ready for that conversation and to be part of it. Conversations, as Angela's talked about as well, and I completely agree, often look very different too. So for the community that I am part of, our dialogues will be shared across different Indigenous nations. And we really realise that they're not homogenous stories, that everyone comes with different lived experiences, perspectives, and understandings. And again, you know, those ideas around being held in respect and responsiveness is really crucial, I think, in that space, and is often a missing part of, I think, dialogue, broadly speaking. And sometimes I think we see that in those social media spaces. We don't always see those levels of respect and reciprocity that we'd like upheld as part of dialogue. You know, that we may see that in person, and often people are striving for that in-person connection as part of conversation. But we don't always see it, I think, in social media, and not always online as well. On the online platforms can often be a trickier space to have respectful dialogue sometimes, purely because you don't always get those body language cues, I think, and those sort of spaces where people may need to move on from conversations, or something may be uncomfortable. You know, you don't always get that same interaction. So in Indigenous communities in Australia, and being careful here not to homogenise this space, but broadly speaking, we seek that in-person connection and in-person conversation to ensure that, you know, that we always have that level of respect and reciprocity and responsiveness upheld there.
Thank you so much, Kim, for your thoughts and for just the reminders around respect and reciprocity, especially in terms of navigating an online world now more and more. These pieces are so important, and it really relates to what Angela was mentioning around the nuance that sometimes is missing in terms of online spaces. And here we are online. So I'm very happy to turn it over to you, Nidhi, to hear, to learn about some of your thoughts.
So what a nice way to lead us in, Angela, and, you know, to think about, when you think about conversations, using our whole bodies in many ways to create those conversations. And again, what Kim said about respect and having respectful conversations, and also making space for those in-person connection to have a conversation. And I think those are some things I wanted to kind of explore in what I'll be talking. And currently I teach undergraduate students. And when Kim said, respectful conversation, in-person conversation, it made me think of this moment when my student and I, this is early in the morning at 8 a.m. I teach a class, and we were walking in the hallway to get to our class, and I started a conversation. I said, "How are you doing?" And this is a student. I know I've been teaching her for a couple of years, and her family is from Palestine. So that in that hallway in my university, we created space to have that conversation. And she said, "You remember?" And I said, "Of course I did." And she talked about her family, her home in Jerusalem, and what they're experiencing. And I think that talks about that power of conversations. And when I go into a conversation, I try to remember that there is a lot I don't know. And that's what I enter into the conversation thinking, that there's a lot I don't know. And what can I learn from you, from this conversation that we are having, when I have that mindset and I listen, actively listen, and listen with respect. And that's what I did. I listened to her story of what she is going through, her family is going through. And these are real people with real experiences and real stories. And maybe we talked for 10 minutes, but I think that is a powerful conversation that we had, something that we both will remember for a long time. So I think we need to make space for these conversations, and I prefer obviously in-person conversation. And again, going with the mindset that I'm here and I'm here to learn, and I'm here to listen, and I'm here to accept be open to your story, your stories of what that is. And also, we also talked about, and then as we are having right now, these online conversations, I also need a community of practice. And we identify as women of color, immigrants, some of us refugees who came in as refugees from other countries to Canada. And we have conversations in this safe space that we have created online for ourselves, because it's many conversations or many that we would like to have out there in the world may not be accepted. There is a lot of fear around having these conversations. So I think it's important to create that safe space where we can come together to openly converse about these topics that are difficult. And those are the important conversations to have, because conversations that are easy are easy to have. So how do we get to these difficult conversations? And sometimes you need that safe space to know that I can present an idea and it'll be received, and it'll be listened to, and like Kim said, it'll be respected. And so we talk, of course, in what we do and what we say about listening. There's a lot around that, but do we listen with the intent to know somebody else, right? And do we make space where we feel safe to have these conversations? So yeah, those are just I believe in the power of stories, and that's kind of how I convey how I think and say. So these are some stories that I have lived. These are my experiences. So
Thank you for that, Nidhi. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of Dr. Rachel Berman's book, Corridor Talk. So this was a book that was published that speaks about the conversations in the hall, right? It's sometimes the conversations after these formal meetings where you, in that instance, really validated that student's experience, and were showing that you're listening in a very intentional manner and fashion. And it really relates back to what Kim was saying around stories, right? So I wanted to turn it back over to you, Angela, just in terms of how you've set us up in terms of this dialogue to see if there's anything you wanted to add on to or share.
Well, I appreciate that. I see we're in a circle now and not a line, and I really appreciate that. Yes, corridor talk. There's so much I want to respond to. Thinking about the discussions that happen outside of formal spaces, sometimes that's the place for something. Even with children, sometimes they'll talk on the margins of the classroom, very young children, in the line where they think no one's paying attention, because that is a safer space than at the circle with all the formalities that have been made. Even though the space is made, sometimes they need to happen someplace else. And Nidhi, your student, it brought so many things to mind. That just the question alone posed to her is really a show of care and repair. And even if she was not in a position to respond to you for some reason, just the asking of it communicates so much. I think that might be it for now on that question.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you. And I love that you mentioned we're going in a circle, right? Because we're kind of flattening down those linear modes of thinking and of being. So much appreciated. This piece around space is coming up. And Angela, you mentioned like, you know, when children might have certain conversations in the lineups, or they feel it's a safer space, or you know, there aren't perhaps people listening, people maybe adults, I'm guessing, listening in, or whomever. And then Nidhi, you mentioned safe spaces to come together to speak openly. I think it's a great segue to the question in terms of what this idea of space looks like. So how do we make space for brave and complex conversations that are still informed by care, love, and kindness? What might that look like? And I'll turn it to Nidhi to start, just to kind of change the order, if I may. Yeah.
Yeah, so most of the time, and I take it to my practice. I start my classes with how are we doing today, because I think that is important for us to have that kind of barometer to gauge and create that safe space. It's hard. It's very difficult to ask that question. It's also difficult, I think, for students to receive that question. And there's a lot of discomfort in, you know, and I can see that there's a lot of conversations that we should have, or students would like to have with me. And these are pre-service ECE students that I'm speaking of. Most of the time, there is not much that comes up, but you know, but today when I asked that question, there was a lot of thumbs down, which is, you know, a way of communication. Going back to what Angela said, our bodies, use our bodies to communicate. But also there was a conversation had during the break where one of my students came up to me and said that, you know, he talked about burnout. He talked about experiencing burnout. And there's a lot that weighs on us as educators, as pre-service educators, and that is the lot that is happening personally, you know, in our communities globally, and it is a lot for us to take in. And so so he talked about burnout, and then we had a conversation about care, about kindness to oneself first, because we almost always, you know, when we think of kindness, we think of to others, but sometimes it's important to situate ourselves. and to be kind to ourselves, whether it is, talking about self-care, just opening that conversation to what that means, what that might mean. So that 5-10 minutes that I take in the morning to get a feel of my students, to see how is it that we are doing. So it does open up a little bit, but also I think opens up this the space for of safety, to say that I can talk about something if I need to. And also it opens up a space for courage. I think it's a lot. I think it takes a lot of courage to respond to that and say, how are you doing? And to talk about what we are experiencing, right? So whether it's burnout and another day it was a student who is experiencing homelessness. And this is in the city of Toronto, living out of her car. That was a hard conversation. And, a young person experiencing something like this. And when we think about it, and one of the reason was I was like, I said, where is your assignment? I've been waiting for your assignment. And she said, this is what I'm experiencing. I just don't have the space to write the assignment. So I think as educators, embodying and enacting a pedagogy of love and kindness and compassion is important. To know that, I have provided her some supports now, but I wish she had come to me. But it's a difficult conversation to have, right? And it's not easy, but I'm glad she had that conversation when she did. But I wish, and I told her, anytime you need help, you please make sure, or that we have this conversation, so we can help each other through this. So, and I think, whether it is extra time, whether it is that space to say, let's sit down and say, well, how we may help each other, how can we find support, and so we talk about love, but in academic spaces, I wonder how much of it we practice. So when we talk about the ethic of care, right? Feminist ethics of care, and I wonder how much of it do we actually practice, and how much do we, like Janelle said earlier, how much are we intentional about it in our everyday being in our conversations. So something that I try to be intentional about is creating space for courage, because it takes a lot to be able to have these conversations. And again, going with the idea that I really don't know you, but I would like to know you a little bit better. And how do we be compassionate as human beings to each other, right? And so yeah, that's something that that comes to my mind.
Wow, lots to think about there. Thank you, Nidhi. And the fact that I'm just thinking about your story, and that you're storying with us as you're sharing in dialogue, and the fact that you mentioned the student did come to you who was experiencing being unhoused. That tells me a lot in terms of that active work that you're working towards with your students, right? That sometimes a faculty member would never know that story. So thank you for sharing. I'll turn it over to Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Nidhi. It's just so interesting to hear. And I think I'm really picking up on that idea around courage there. And I think, so much of what is being shared there, and I think broadly for all of us, is those relationalities, and that they're relational dialogues in trust. And And that's really crucial because that's about authentic conversations. And I'm really mindful of that as my work is really intersectional. And I live as a person who experiences legal blindness. So I live in the spaces of disability as well as living in as an Aboriginal woman as well. And I'm a parent as well, and I'm a teacher, and all of these sorts of multiple aspects of our lives that we bring as part of our experiences, I think, to stories in conversation that are enriching and really important and enable, I think, space. But I'm also aware things feel very uneven, and that's something I think that can thwart spaces for open dialogue in conversation to happen authentically, and where people might feel fearful. And governance is one of those spaces that feels very apparent to me. So, for example, as a person experiencing disability, I live within laws and spaces that say that I won't be discriminated against, and actively promote that sort of conversation as well. However, reality says a lot different to that. You know, within the laws that exist around disability discrimination, for example, in Australia, and indeed in many places in the world, what might look like on paper about not discriminating against people is very different, because many organisations and institutions can opt out of including someone if it's too hard to provide reasonable adjustments for a person. And so I'm mentioning that in the sense that if you're living in a world where you may not be included for a number of reasons, whether it's your housing situation, whether it's you know, your family living through war, whether, you know, your own experiences suggest that, you know, for me as a person experiencing legal blindness, every day I have to actively work towards my own inclusion in many different areas. And there are a lot of conversations to have when you have to actively do those different things if governance suggests otherwise. And that's fatiguing. And so sometimes conversations, I think, and the spaces that they take place can also be quite tiring if you have to keep having those dialogues all the time to ensure, you know, on a basic level, your own safety, for example. As an Aboriginal woman as well, last year in Australia, and some of you might know about this outside of Australia as well, we had a referendum where everybody of voting age voted as to whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people could be enshrined in our constitution to actively have a voice, a conversation at a parliamentary level, and that was voted down. So on one hand, we're included in conversations in Australia as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but in our, you know, in also day-to-day realities and at a governmental level, actually we're not included as part of conversation. And so courage can look very different there, I think, because if it's fatiguing, it may not be that you don't want to have conversation, for example. It may be that you're continually trying to have those conversations in order to be actually participating and included on a day-to-day level.
Thanks so much for that, Kim. And I think even the last example you provided reminds me at least about the piece that you shared at the beginning around governance, what is being written and what is actually happening in action, and Indigenous governance and sovereignty, and questions of when are folks given a seat at the pre-existing table, if you would. So the piece around the fatigue is bringing up fatigue that myself and many Black folks experienced post George Floyd, in terms of conversations of education, where you need to educate your friends, educate your peers, educate your students, and constantly have to speak about your humanity, if you would, and really speak about all of the issues that you're confronted with before the killing of George Floyd, but now it's coming like right at you constantly, and that quest for survival, and thinking beyond survival. So I'm curious now to learn from Angela, um, in terms of your thoughts on this question. How do we make space? Because you actually brought it up earlier too, in terms of the spaces, right? And the classroom dynamic with children. So how do we make space for brave and complex conversations that are informed by care, love, and kindness?
Well, you've all given me so much to think with. And my heart is full to be able to be in conversation with you. Thinking first about Australia and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and space, we can't talk about that without talking about land back. And the voice to Parliament being voted down that Kim just mentioned really shifted the energy here. It reminded me of after Trump was elected in the US, and also after George Floyd was killed, those moments that your perception of the place that you live and the situation changes. And currently in Melbourne, there is a group of Aboriginal people who are taking back land at Camp Sovereignty. And they're saying, we're starting with this little patch of land and we're not going anywhere. And they've been there for a long time now. And they open it up for people to come and sit with them with a nightly campfire. And it's just a way of saying we're here and we haven't gone anywhere. And for people to come and kind of breathe life into that space and say, we stand with you and we see you. And your voice is important. And thinking also about other situations that might make people feel marginalized, and many of them have been mentioned already. Sometimes because of the fatigue that people might feel from their situation, or other reasons of feeling kind of cast aside. Just saying, I see you, I witness you. And that can be the start of a complex conversation. But I think the courage it takes to say, I see you, is sometimes the most important thing, because I ran upon this quote earlier that I think it's this is me talking, I think it's a really important, powerful endeavor in the era of fake news and even manufactured AI images in this kind of Trump or hopefully post-Trump era, just to be able to hear about people suffering, to be able to hear and witness their struggle and their experience without turning away. That is a huge start. And what you said, Nidhi, about maybe our practice is not aligning with who we think of ourselves or how we position ourselves. I think there's plenty of room to be scared, to just default to comfort, even when we position ourselves differently. And so it's kind of shining a light on those spaces that are always there and making space for other people. I've noticed sometimes we need to qualify someone else's experience or counter it instead of just listening to what they say, you know? Yes, I hear you, and all lives matter, or that kind of qualifying. I've come to think of it as another way of looking away. And the quote, and then I'll take a little pause. And it's not even a quote. It's Haraway saying care requires curiosity. She was criticizing Derrida and Rose and Van Doren. Caring means becoming subject to the unsettling obligation of curiosity, which requires knowing more at the end of the day than you did at the beginning. So not making assumptions and writing someone or people off, or all of the things that we write off that we assume we know, because that silence is part of colonization. And listening to our introductions, I realize we're all people working in decolonial ways or anti-colonial ways. And that requires the breaking of silences, even when it's incredibly uncomfortable.
Wow, I'm just here talking to myself. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Thank you, Angela. I wonder if anyone has any reactions they'd like to share before we move to the third question. But it does lead us nicely into the third question, what Angela just provided, the quote and all of those thoughts and examples. So I'll just pause because that's okay too. So when you see my head down, I'm really taking notes because this is just, wow. Nidhi?
So, Kim, and so wonderful to just listen. I could just sit and listen to you all day. And so, Angela, same to you. And like Janelle said, I was saying yes many times in my head out loud. But one thing, Angela, that you said was this on how comfortable we get, right? And in many of these spaces, and by not stepping into discomfort or avoiding it or pretending it doesn't exist. Recently I've been listening to and reading about the archaeology of self. So again, this is the work done by Dr. Celie Ruiz, and she's a Black scholar, and she works in education, and talks about educators doing a deep dive into yourself, and looking deep into yourself, into what you're comfortable with. And many of the times we're very comfortable to sit with our biases or to not look at them or not even acknowledge them. And that's what you said made me think about, is that how do we get into ourselves, not just with the comfortable aspects of ourselves, but and we are talking about these uncomfortable conversations. So with the discomfort that we have with many aspects of ourselves, and Kim was talking about our various intersections that we stand at, different aspects of our identity. So what are the discomforts that we feel, we think we bring to our practice, to ourselves, into teaching with children, with families. So yeah, yes, I just wanted to, that's what you made me think, both of you made me think about. So.
Thanks for that thought, Nidhi. And this piece on self and what you're reading around archaeology of self, a lot of the discussion we're having reminds me of Black feminist scholarship, where we need to situate ourselves despite colonial education that says we need to be masters of knowledge. It's a reclamation of ways of knowing and ways of being where you situate yourself in terms of those comfort pieces that you mentioned, that you all mentioned around really thinking around what I'm possibly most comfortable with is perhaps what's furthest from me. And that means it's like with anti-oppression, that's perhaps my privilege that I experience, but really taking that deep dive, as you say, Nidhi, in terms of that work from an intersectional perspective, as you say, Kim, to have the conversations that are not being had is a way of pushing back really against the pushing back all around, right? In terms of dominant knowledge without an S. And Angela, you mentioned you can't talk, I wrote it down, but my handwriting's so messy. Can't talk about that without talking about land back. So you brought up land back. I think that's a very important segue to our third and final question in the next 10 minutes. Really, what conversations, and you all have picked up on the conversations that are not being had. So really for us to think through, what are the conversations that are not being had, and how might we engage in conversations guided and held by and within pedagogies of discomfort? And I'm really thinking of what Kim mentioned around relational dialogue, and that dialogue in thinking of working with and alongside children too. What are the conversations that are not necessarily being had, and how can we have conversations that are guided by pedagogies of discomfort? So I'll turn it to Kim first this time.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I'm really, yeah, just so honored, I think, to be part of this conversation. It's so enriching hearing from everyone, and I really think that notion of Haraway's work and, you know, curiosity, I think is a way to, you know, it's a really great way to think about the conversations exactly that are not being had, because I think that's what stymies conversation when people do turn away. And we do see that in many spaces. So you know, at a broad level, we see that through governance, as I've already talked about. I think sometimes we see that through our social media platforms, but I am mindful as well for children, even in those adolescent years, that much of the conversations I think that are generated, and sometimes really deep conversations. And I think about my own children and the way that they're deeply interacting with information around Palestine at the moment. And so much of that is generated, I think, through our social media platforms that actually generate deeper and critical thinking in some spaces as well, and enable conversation. Not always, but we do see this, I think, more and more. And I think of, if I'm just going to my own children, but another child who's really engaging in what conversations look like around artificial intelligence and what this might look like, generative artificial intelligence going forward, and how that might impact the stories that we do tell, and who gets to actually dominate in those spaces, through artificial intelligence. And these are all really big impacts, I think, on our pedagogical practices with children, because our children are existing in a world where some conversations are enabled and I think some are silenced, and some are in between those spaces as well. But it will be their curiosity, I think, that will be enabling of conversations, and it will take educators going forward to keep enabling differing conversations to be had. But, that also exists within spaces that are governed. It also exists in spaces where families have different experiences and opinions and views on what may be, what they're feeling like can be shared with children. We still see discourses around children being innocent and being viewed in that way, and not as change agents and, agentic people who can actually continue conversations and can try and increase their own knowledges and do this relationally with other people. And we see this in many different spaces. And I'm even reminded of, I think, it was definitely Donald Trump, but, spoke of, children just need to be thinking about Disney princesses and, and be, taken away from conversations. And it's those notions of innocence and, exactly, I get, setting particular agendas that actually do not view children as people who can actually have complex dialogues and learn in those spaces. And there's some of, I think, the avenues that do shut down conversation and also enable people to rise up in those conversations that keep shutting down things. So, where we see trolling and different things happening like that in our social media spaces that take away from conversation. And I'm particularly reminded of that in terms of being Aboriginal and post the referendum, where, it was the voice to Parliament was shut down and voted against. And as a consequence of that, and I know most countries do have a national day, but the National Day for Australia, which Aboriginal people generally talk about as just January 26, is a day where particular dominant discourses around what it is to be Australian are celebrated. And these are really, colonised spaces and, in a Kubra hats and out on the land and conquering, the lands around us, and different things like that are often brought to the foreground. And I don't think I've seen as many Australian flags that continually reminded, just symbolically in conversation, that just to remind you, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this is our land and not yours. It gave that kind of credence, that credibility to raise, those dominant discourses, and for conversations to that decolonize not to be upheld. It didn't feel like a culturally safe space at all this year on that National Day. And other days, it can actually, on that day, feel like a space that you can speak back a little bit. But this year it didn't feel like that. And it was post-referendum, I think, that enabled those colonised spaces to become really apparent. So I'm really mindful of, different things that happen in the world and the influences there that can stop those complexities to some extent, and where fatigue may enter because you have to keep, as you talked about, Janelle, speaking back and re-educating, and they're constant dialogues, I think.
Thank you for that, thank you for that, Kim. And now I'm turning it over to Nidhi.
So thank you for that, Kim. There's a lot in there to take and to understand and to learn your point of view. It's just been, I keep saying that it's just amazing just to listen to you. So as I was thinking about the conversations that are not being had, I'm going to share some of the questions that I have received from my students, from children, from educators who are working right now here. These are the people I'm in contact with. We talk about relationality and how I make meaning. I make meaning with them to learn more about myself and how we are in relationship with each other. So my research, my doctoral research, I did with the group of refugee children and families, young children. Kim said we think of children as innocent, and even though we know children are capable and competent, and so these were young children. I looked at the population from Syria. So these are families and children who have moved here from Syria, and one of the children. So we told stories about their displacement, about resettlement, about war. These are very difficult conversations to be had. So one of the questions one of the moms asked me was that, why do you want to know these? Why are you interested? So another aspect of it is that, and what are the questions that we are not asking? What are the stories we are not listening to, right? Why are we not making space for for their stories? This is a similar thing that the children told me. Why do you want to know about us? Why us? Why not you? And that's something I asked them. And along with children who are immigrants and refugees, we talk a lot about trauma-informed practice for educators. But one of the things that I learned from these children was how we re-traumatize them by just, plopping them into the school system here and saying, figure it out, for the most part, especially when they come with other strengths, especially with communication and language, when they come with other strengths. And we know our dominance in our country is, it is, we still think with colonial ways when they think of education and dominance of language in education. So, and they talk, and the children asked me about and said, do you think about how we get re-traumatized by the expectation that we are children and we'll figure this out? And it takes us a long time for us to learn English. And every day that we learn is traumatic. So these are some of the difficult conversations that I've had to engage in with children who identify as refugees, children who identify as immigrants. And recently there was a question that was asked by, we just had a conversation last week, and this was a student of color. She identifies as Asian. And she said, we have definitely come a long way, but where are the scholars who look like me? And I see you. That is just pointing to me. And she said, but we don't really read. We don't really think with scholars like you and me. Why is that? Now we see definitely influx of Black scholars in our scholarship and what we are doing. But she still said, where are my stories and the stories of my people? And where are your stories and stories of your people? Why don't we have representation? That is a very difficult question. And these are the questions that keep me in a space of discomfort. So I'll leave it to that and hand it to Angela.
Thanks, Nidhi. Over to you, Angela.
Thanks again for your stories. They just kind of bring everything to life. Well, circling back to this idea about conversations that are not being had and silence as a colonial tool, a settler colonial tool that we use on each other and ourselves. Kind of saying anything in a case that you care about, even if it's messy and imperfect, I think it's silence breaking and therefore it's decolonial. And you never become so aware of how you are as a person, your attributes, or how you're viewed as when you're changing countries. And I think after a lifetime of working with young children very young children just express what they need to express, whether it's orally or multimodally or with their bodies or their behavior. If it needs to come out, it's going to come out. And back to you, Kim, about having at the very beginning, you said having conversations with people who are ready, assuming that they are ready. And we can assume that of children. It doesn't mean being careless, right? Because I think sometimes I feel like a bull in a china shop. It's careful, but it's modeling sometimes even for our students in tertiary classrooms, messy and imperfect conversations. And I think of the land acknowledgements as part of that. For me, I was needing to give land acknowledgements on Zoom for students in Australia and a lot in Asia when I was still in the US. So talk about imperfect, but it's that silence breaking. It's just that attempt and modeling, giving voice to the things that you care about, even if it's a learning curve and you're not doing it in your best way, I think is incredible modeling. And just a incredible practice for people of any age. So, and something way earlier we were talking about, why do we think that you telling your experience is going to negate mine? It's practicing talking about our experiences. And, oh, I skipped something about the land acknowledgement. Here I am modeling messiness in action. I wanted to say that when we give them, we know that sometimes land acknowledgements are a contested practice. They're not universally accepted. So I teach a First Nations class, and I just talk about how my land acknowledgement, especially as a white settler woman to Australia, is imperfect, partial, and contested. But yet without it, we have silence, and we can't have silence. I think that might be it. I was thinking the last part about why do we think you telling your experience is going to negate mine? That witnessing and testifying witnessing is so important. And going to every Sunday, the protests in Melbourne, the first hour is this incredible pedagogical experience, really, for me, learning about other people's experiences that I could have not possibly had, that fuel the reasons we're going to be walking alongside each other at these protests. That witnessing. And for the Black Lives Matter protests in Portland, it was a similar thing where I'd lived in the city for 20 years or more, and yet sometimes following the pickup truck with the person in it who's speaking, young Black person from my neighborhood sometimes, was the first time I got to witness those stories. And not as a voyeur, but as someone who's walking behind that truck. And I'm gonna reverse pull this bull out of the china shop now. And no, we don't have a china shop. We're doing great.
Thank you, Angela. And I think this is a great time to segue to discussion with folks who are joining us today, attendees. If you'd like, we can do what Angela said around the modeling of what dialogue looks like. So you will be invited. We're going to switch from Zoom webinar format and transport to a Zoom meeting format. So you'll be available as attendees showing up on screen. And we could open it up for some questions. We do have some time for a few questions or thoughts or comments, reactions to all of what was said. And just accept the Zoom meeting invite, which will be coming up on your screen. So I actually see folks joining in now. And as you're making that voyage over here, the journey here, I'll just let you know that I'm going to acknowledge raise hands. If you have questions, you can click the raise hand function right at the bottom of the Zoom screen where it says raise hand. And if that's not accessible to you, you could type into the chat. And if you'd like, you could direct your question to one panelist or all panelists, or just put the question out there and see who picks up on that. And when I receive questions in the chat, if that's your preferred method, I will read them out to the panelists, just in terms of accessibility. So raise hand will be acknowledged, and yeah, I'm looking forward to learning from you all, and thank you for staying with us and for engaging in this portion of the salon, if you would. All right, so I saw a raise hand, but it went down. Let's see. Okay, great. So over to you, Mara.
First of all, I want to thank you so much. It was brilliant. There were so many nuggets of just wisdom that I am just sort of digesting. So thank you so much. I think the most important thing for me, because it relates to work that I'm doing, is looking at why teachers are so terrified to have these conversations, with children. And what is it about their own vulnerability or struggles or uncertainty that make them want to silence children, and just how, as a teacher educator, if you have thoughts on how do we get teachers to be better at stepping into that messy stuff, even if that means saying to the kid, I'm so sorry that happened and I don't even have words for, or, in other words, that whole idea of unless I know what to say, I better not acknowledge it. And my example was that a child who went to school and had seen unhoused children on the sidewalk living in boxes and was very distressed, as they should be, and said to the teacher, I don't understand, what are those children living and how do they get food and where do they go to the bathroom and blah, blah, blah. And the teacher's response was, well, we all live in different kinds of houses, which is true, but that was not addressing that child's pain and grief and questions, et cetera. And so if you have any thoughts on how do we get teachers to be more courageous going into the mucky stuff.
Sorry, I'll mute myself there. Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think a really crucial one. It just reminded me, I think, in particular around when I think of spaces for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families and communities, a few things there. We have a really long colonised history in Australia, as many people would know, and certainly that's the case for many countries as well. So it's been a contested space to even have our voices in childhood educational spaces and even in curriculum. And we're seeing that actually more and more. We just had an update of our early years learning framework curriculum, which actually really speaks to embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives in educational work with children. However, many teachers here and even pre-service teachers as well identify that this is a really hard thing to do and are very worried about it being authentic. And then as part of that, and we'd certainly talk about this in Black disability here in Australia, there's an avoidance tendency, and I think which is what you're kind of referring to there as well. And so it becomes easier to just not have any conversations rather than kind of, feel like you might appropriate or do the wrong thing. That comes up a lot in data. And so for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I led a forum a few years ago, and what our elders said at that forum is we would rather people have a try and engage. And I think Angela really referred to this as well. Even if it's messy, even if it's, imperfect, than to just continue with silence. And I think it was actually that message in hearing it from Aboriginal elders that I think actually you could always feel a sense of relief almost in the room, because people went, oh, okay, I can just have a go. And I think, two things need to sort of happen there. It's that permission, if you like, and that enabling, but at the same time, education that needs to go alongside. And we would talk about alongside here rather than with, because that needs to happen at the same time and alongside, because when that happens, it still presumes that the person who has the space to enable that voice, in this case, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, can actually determine what actually can kind of be said, rather than a colonised space that has said, oh, we want to hear your voice, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but only if it's on our terms. And so that's kind of the difference. So we continue that education and that cultural responsive education and cultural nourishing education in our early childhood communities alongside pre-service teachers and teachers. But we also let teachers as well try, so that they can then continue those conversations with us about what they are doing. And that enables, I think, respect and responsivity to continue and to also try and flourish, I think, as part of that.
So is it okay to jump in?
For sure, for sure.
So thank you, Kim. And I want to just pick up on what Mara talked about, being vulnerable, and also what Kim, some of the ideas that you're talking about. So when we're talking about, families at war or people experiencing homelessness, so these are topics that we might think of as difficult, and like Angela said, it's disrespectful if we don't do anything about it. But on the other hand, like the Kim mentioned, that we don't prepare, I think, enough, our pre-service educators, to go out there and to have these difficult or conversations about these knowledges that, about class. So class is something that we don't think or talk much about in early childhood education. So And what made me and when I thought about vulnerability that Mara you mentioned, I think of what Bell Hooks mentioned about mutual vulnerability. So how do we make space to be mutually vulnerable and use vulnerability as a generative aspect of education rather than something that thinking something as a negative or something that that makes you think of a person as not good enough, right? So how do we create that space where we acknowledge that we are not, we get into that messy space that Angela was talking about. We get in this mess of knowing that we don't prepare our students enough, or even the educators out there with the children saying that, how do we talk about people who don't have a home and who are living in a box? Right? What is it we know about, and acknowledge what we know, how it makes us feel, and start having those conversations where we acknowledge alongside children that there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we don't know how to go around. So, but it's important to engage in those conversations. So I would say, how do we create the space where we are mutually vulnerable, and we learn alongside children or what it is, about difficult knowledges, whether it is race and how people are discriminated based on race or racism, whether it is homelessness, which is another, topic, or whether it's even indigenous knowledges that we really pick and choose on what we choose to talk about, but there's a lot we don't know and we don't talk about. So when my student asked, where are these knowledges that we don't know? We need to find out together. And it's important to acknowledge that there's a lot we don't know, seek help, and maybe, dig into that topic together as to how we may find out more and how far we need to go to make sure that children know what's happening around them. So it's not okay to say, this is the way they live. Yes, of course, it is the way they live. It's an acknowledgement of who they are, but how did they get there? And how do as a society we see, we watch, and then there's nothing being done, right? About housing, homelessness. And yeah, so I just wanted to just share that as to how we need to be mutually vulnerable.
Thanks, Nidhi. Angela.
Thank you both, and thank you for the question. And I'm thinking that so much in that moment, as you tell the story, Mara, I'm there with the teacher in that moment, feeling like it's happening to me, and thinking the relationality of your connection to the children and the moment and everything that's happening would help to guide a response. And maybe the proper response is no response, or just to let a question hang in the air initially, and just to have some slow pedagogy around feeling the awkward, uncomfortable moment of witnessing a person who sleeps on the street. And if a child said, is that where they sleep? I don't remember the child's question. Something like, I wonder, or I wonder what happens when it rains at night. And just witnessing it together, and then kind of figuring out a next step later. There's something about a response, even if it's a completely accurate response, or could be considered a response of care in a classroom context when we're talking about it, removed from its context, is still a closure. There was a question, that's the answer. The answer is people live in all different types of places. And that just really puts a closure on things that that aren't ready to be closed.
Thank you, Angela, and thanks, Mara, for your question. I think we have time for another question at this point, or comment or thoughts. And thanks everyone for sharing in the chat too. And what I'm seeing in the chat is around folks having to leave and saying thanks for the dialogue, the discussion. So there weren't any questions in the chat, just to make that clear. See also thanks and gratitude, more gratitude in the chat. I'll just pause. As Angela just modeled through your response too about being able to pause, and I'm mindful of the time in that you know, we had a rich dialogue, and I love that we're able to come here and be together in this format too. It feels like another layer of coming together. So I wanted to say that in inviting everyone into this space right here, there is also an invitation for each of you to be a part of these this global conversation series. I'm extending this invitation to all of you here right now to say that if there's an idea or a conversation that you want to pick up on and extend on, do feel free to reach out to myself or Chelsea. You could feel free to be in touch to help co-organize anything that you have in mind. Just to say that the conversation does not end here. I do see Dr. Block wrote, I wonder about the selection of educators and inclusion of families. Do you want to speak to that? Yep.
Yeah, it's going back to the other questions. It's pretty late to bring up a new thing, but in most of the conversations, I heard us talking about educators, and I think that the hierarchies in the at least in the USA, in the groups of educators, means that many of the teachers have possibly less experience with some of these difficult issues than family members, or than even some of the other educators that are not called teachers. And I don't know whether that's true in other places or not, but I wonder if we have time, or at least I wanted to bring that up. But more than anything, I know we hardly have any time, so I wanted to thank everybody, including the organizers, for the wonderful conversation. So if there's time to discuss that, I just wanted to bring it up though. But thank you all so much. Yeah. So good to see people also.
Thank you.